Okay, board members, we're going to get back after it, so I'd ask you to take your seats. And we have Assistant Superintendent Darren Nielsen is up next. I think he's coming in from those soft seats way in the back.
Darren hasn't been in a soft seat for months.
For the record, Board Member Belknap was out of order, she's correct though. Assistant Superintendent Darren Nielsen, and I didn't call you Bruff. Remember that day I called you Bruff?
That's
up
okay.
At the Hill about 3 times, and I don't think
That sounds like a
I'm
good-
going to do that again.
That sounds like a good name. I wasn't offended. There's
There
lots
you
of
go.
good Bruffs, I'm sure. Darren Nielsen, Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning. I also brought with me Sydney Dixon, Sydney Carter. See, there you go. You get me.
I jinxed you.
We're similar dresses today.
So the
Oh,
rest of
brother.
the day is going to go like that, so that I can feel good and you can feel good, right?
She's our Assessment Development Coordinator, and she oversaw the Utah Aspire standard setting process. The first week in August, we gathered together 80 educators from across the state of Utah. They included educators that were 9th and 10th grade content teachers. We had representation from institutions of higher education who affiliate with concurrent enrollment, and also our advanced placement programs, because the outcomes of this assessment are supposed to be highly correlated and actually predictive of a student's ACT score. The reason that standard setting has to occur is there's really 2 circumstances where we have to complete this process. One is whenever a new assessment is purchased or developed, and it seems like we have one going on every year, whether it's the KEEP or PEEP or something else. But we go through the standard setting process, and it's simply a rigorous set of activities designed to determine what does the student who is proficient in the standards that we're testing or measuring with that assessment look like. What would be the score that we would say a student is proficient, and then the associated other scores that we have. But that's really the starting point. The other setting where standard settings occurs, if you remember from last year, is whenever standards are changed. So in our case, if standards are changed by the board, then the subsequent assessment questions have to be changed, and then we go through a standard setting process again through that. So if it's okay with you, Chair, I'd like to turn the time over to Sydney Carter to talk about the details of that process. So.
Okay, and feel free to state your name, title, and all that, and we'll get.
You bet.
And the Sydney starts with a C. So
Yes, Sydney with the C. Sydney
All right.
Carter, I'm the Assessment Development Coordinator here at USBE. And so my team and I were able to work with our partners at Pearson this year as we've delivered and developed the Utah Aspire Plus test for the students in 9th grade and 10th grade. As Darren mentioned, we were able to hold this standard setting the first week of August and bring together educators from across the state to provide us their expertise and feedback on where they believe the cuts should be for proficiency for this assessment for students. So really the goal of the meeting was to determine cuts for 9th grade and 10th grade in the 4 content areas that were assessed. And then those cut recommendations are delivered here to you today for you to provide your feedback and hopefully approval on the recommendations from that committee. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about the Utah Aspire Plus assessment. It is a high school assessment, and this past spring was the first year that it was administered for students in grade 9 and 10. There were 2 legislated elements to this assessment. The first is that the assessment has to provide a predictive college career readiness assessment, and that's measured by the ACT here in Utah. And the second element that was legislated is that we provide a growth score between 9th grade and 10th grade. So with this assessment, it's a little bit different than what we've had in the past. In 9th and 10th grade, we were measuring 4 different contents. It was English, reading, science, and math. Those are similar to what students would see on the ACT. And the design of this assessment was a little bit different than what we've had in the past. First of all, the things that were similar or stayed the same was that each of the items on the assessment were aligned to the Utah core standards. So we actually brought in educators earlier back last fall to review all of the items that were being incorporated from both the from the ACT Aspire banks as well as our Utah items, and make sure that those items were still aligned to the core standards for Utah. One big change was that this is a fixed form assessment. In our 3rd through 8th grade assessment, it's a computer adaptive test, and so that was legislated in 3rd through 8th grade. It is not legislated in 9th and 10th grade. So one large change for teachers and for students this year was that they participated in a fixed form assessment where students saw the same items for each of the contents. The item types were similar to what we've had in the past. We still had multiple choice items as well as technology enhanced items. And one difference was there were no open response questions. So there was not a writing portion or no short answer questions. Another difference was this test was timed. So one of the elements as we were looking at developing this assessment, feedback from parents and from educators was that students really didn't have an opportunity with taking a timed test until they took the ACT, and they felt like that was a disadvantage for students. And so they really wanted this test to be a timed test to give students an experience with that type of assessment. So the Utah Aspire Plus is a timed test. And then finally, one big shift that was felt and seen by teachers especially and students was that the assessment changed from a course-based or content-based test to a grade-based test. So all students in 9th grade took the 9th grade test, no matter which math or science course they were enrolled in. So the standard setting process followed these steps. Really, the participants came and they experienced the test. They actually took the test that the 9th and 10th graders took for each of the content areas that they were experts in. And then they developed borderline descriptions. So these borderline descriptions were, what would you say a student would be able to do who was just barely proficient or just barely highly proficient? So they developed what that borderline description would be, and that helped them to determine, is this a proficient student be able to answer this question or not? And what would be that threshold of where they would be bumped up into the next category? And then they were able to provide their judgment on the items of how students would respond to those questions. And finally, they were able to see data and discuss their feedback of where they felt those cuts would be. And this happened for 3 different rounds. So teachers were able to take the test, provide their feedback on how students would answer those questions, and then discuss that with the other participants in the room, and then go back through and take the test again and adjust until we did that 3 times until we got a pretty narrow feel for what we felt students or the participants felt that students would be proficient or not in each of those questions. So as the participants read each item, they really wanted to consider what were the knowledge and skills that a student would need to be able to answer this question, as well as what are the knowledge and skills that a student who was a borderline student, that just barely above that threshold, how would they answer that question? So as they went through, let me kind of get through each of those to present that. Participants were asking themselves each time they looked at a question on the test, how many points would a student get? So on this assessment, there are questions that were 2-point questions, 1-point question, or a student could receive 0 points if they answered it incorrectly. So how many points might a student get if they were just barely that borderline proficient? And how many points would they likely earn? So we were asking the participants to think 2 out of 3 times. If 2 out of 3 times a student were answering this question, how many points would they get? Would they get it correct? Would they get 1 point, 0 points? To help them narrow down the highly proficient, proficient, and approaching proficient categories where we'd put those cuts. So all of that comes to, it narrowed down to our recommended cuts from our participants. You can see on this spreadsheet or this table, we've broken it down to English and reading and then an overall ELA score. That ELA score is what will be used for accountability for 9th and 10th grade. And the students will still get a score in English and a score in reading similar to what they receive on the ACT. There's also a math and a science score and then a STEM score that's information because that's similar to something they would see on the ACT as well. So these were the cuts where the participants felt students who were below proficient, approaching proficient, proficient, or highly proficient might fall. You can see there are a couple places where the numbers are highlighted, and those highlights indicate where the committee felt like they came to an answer, so they recommended where the cuts would be, and they weren't as confident in where those recommended cuts would be. And so we were able to look within a standard error of judgment, which means there's a range of scaled scores to at any point that the student would be answering that question, there's a range of, on any given day, they would fall within this many points. And so within that one standard error of judgment, we adjusted by 1 or 2 points anywhere that it was highlighted to show that it was still within the committee recommendations, but it helped us to get more narrow on what we were felt like accurately portrayed what the students were doing at those levels. So those are the actual scale score cuts that we're recommending for you to approve. The next table shows the other element that we are required to provide is that predictive score for the ACT. And so in this table, you can see for each grade level what that proficiency cut score was. So in this example, English grade 9, that low level, the lowest end of scale score for the proficient level is a 201. And that student received a predictive ACT score between 15 to 23. And the ACT College and Career benchmark for English is 18. So these predictive bands are fairly large this year. What we're hoping is in the next 3 years, those predictive bands will get smaller and smaller as we have students that this year will take the ACT as an 11th grader, and last year they took the Utah Aspire Plus as a 10th grader, and we'll be able to correlate those scores and make those bands smaller and smaller of their predictive score for the ACT. And then finally, what this means for students in Utah. So you can see with the spring 2019 data, if we use the recommended cuts, these will be the amount of students, or the percent of students proficient across the state in each of the categories. So below proficient, approaching proficient, proficient, and highly proficient. These are fairly similar to what we've had in the past for when students participated on SAGE. There are some differences. So one of the big differences with ELA, we were a little bit higher than we've been in the past with our overall ELA scores on SAGE. As we looked at what was being assessed, one of the big differences from what we've had with SAGE is that we had a whole English test. The English test is grammar, punctuation, spelling, skills that students typically have mastered by 9th and 10th grade, and we have those are a little bit higher than the reading cut scores or percents of student that we've had proficient. And so that can help to be one of the indicators of why we have more students proficient in ELA in 9th and 10th grade than we've had in the past. Another difference is that students do not have writing included in the overall ELA score, and this is the first year that that's not been included. The other big difference is in science. We have quite fewer students proficient in science than we've had in the past. Also a big change in the assessment. This science was one of the places where it was noted quite heavily that instead of being a content-based assessment, it was a grade-based assessment. So students that were in the past taking chemistry courses and had a chemistry test, this year they had a 10th grade test that had items that were content agnostic, but just overall general scientific process questions. And so there are differences from what students have seen in the tests in the past. So I think that is all of the information that I have to present, but I'm not sure if we have any questions.
Okay. Question from board members. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
I just have a couple questions. First one is the ACT a normed test, the regular ACT?
Please.
Yeah, Chair, the ACT is a normed test.
So can I ask a follow-up
Follow-up.
question? So when you talk about your predictive points, like how do you predict how well they're going to do, how do you statistically bring those two things together so that you can predict if there's a possibility that that's going to change over time, as well as our test, this hybrid test, do we have complete control over on how it's graded, or is it part of it, or is it normed in any way over time? So.
Please.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, the Utah Aspire test, which is, as you mentioned, a hybrid, we have complete control. The board has complete control over that test. We take items that are associated with the the ACT Aspire test, and we pull some of those into our Utah Aspire Plus. And fill it in also. In an ideal world, it would be about 50% of the questions would come from ACT's Aspire item bank and 50% from ours. There are some examples in our core where that's not the case because there's not enough ACT items that align with our core standards that we get to 50%. I believe math is an example of that, where a lot of the ACT Aspire items are measuring things that would be found in our core, but not found in our 9th or 10th grade core, found in our 6th, 7th, 8th grade core. So we have a higher percentage of our items that are there, and it's a criterion reference test, not norm referenced. But you've seen there's some challenges when it comes to the standard setting process with also having a requirement to have a predictive ACT score. That gets a little confusing, and it was one of the challenges this committee of teachers had to grapple with during the standard setting process in October. The reason those confidence intervals are so wide right now is if we used 100% of the items out of ACT's item bank, ACT Aspire, they have a large data set, and so they can be really, really clear on what the predictability is towards the ACT. Because we haven't done that work with our Utah core items, it'll take 3 years before we get through. So tell all of our kids who are in 9th, take the 9th grade ACT, or Utah Aspire, 10th grade Utah Aspire, and then the ACT. And then we have a large data set, and we can really narrow that in. But our standard setting process still goes right down to the item level, to where teachers looked at each item and said, would a student who's proficient be able to answer this question? So I don't know if that helps clarify that at all or not.
Do you have a follow-up?
So if I understand.
Hang on.
So if I understand you correctly, that in order to get that predictive score, because of our questions are 50-50 and the ACT is normed, that's why that bound is so large, the zone between, you get a 15 or 23, is that why that's such a wide number? Because the difficulty of pulling that together?
Yeah, to a small degree. The real barrier we have is making sure we get a solid predictive data with our Utah item bank. So if we didn't bring in any Utah item banks and we didn't have a hybrid and we just purchased off the shelf the ACT's Aspire, that confidence interval will be much narrower. We'll get to that point after the 3rd year of our assessment, and then be with much more precision, be able to provide our students what their predictive ACT score is.
Okay. Board Member Gravitt.
So I had a couple of conversations with participants on this committee, and their impression was, this is just an example, that when they took the 9th grade reading, for example, there were more 2-part questions. And they felt that the 9th grade reading test was much more difficult than the 10th grade reading test because of that. And I just want to make sure, did the cut scores take that into account, or am I totally off base with the difficulty?
I'll have you answer that since you saw it and
Yeah.
were in on those discussions.
Yeah, so one of the, as we're looking at item development and including
Yeah.
items on the assessment, we don't have the same Utah items every year, so
Yeah.
that will vary from year to
Okay.
year. As far as what types of questions are on the test, we always have a blueprint, so we're always testing the same standards and the same number of points, and the same actual amount of items, but it will vary on how many 2-part or 1-part questions are there for students. But as far as did that come into account as they were looking at the assessment, it did, because teachers were looking at that particular
Oh,
item
good.
and saying, on this item, are students who are proficient able to answer this question 2 out of 3 times correctly? So that was taken into account.
Thank you
this
so
year.
much.
Thank you.
Okay. Board Member Jenny Earl.
Yes, I have just a couple of questions. So the teachers are able to read through the questions or take the test. Am I understanding that correctly? Then they're able to score based on, whatever specifically you need them to do, right? So why did they remove I'm just, in the law, it's removed that the parent review committee would go through these questions. My understanding was, or from what I heard, is that the reason why is because it was Aspire's test and we'd run risks of having people read it, but we're having our educators read it. So I guess I'm just wondering what happened there.
Okay. I can address that one. The parent review panel is still in existence, and they're scheduled to meet in December. But by statute, they're delegated authority over the Utah Standards Assessment. So that's our grades 3 through 8. They review all of those items. But for the high school assessment, grades 9 and 10, there's not a parent review committee as part
Previously
of that.
there was, though. And then when we went to Aspire, my understanding is because it was an outside entity, they said, well, we're not going to have people
Yeah.
reading those questions.
Yeah, so I can confirm that that's not true. The outside entity didn't put any parameters on us, in this case Pearson or ACT.
So we just wrote it into law then.
No, the Utah Standards Assessment, I don't remember the statute, it's 303. It specifically in that statute calls out the Parent Review Committee, and it's originally was for grades 3 through 11. Then that statute was for 3 through 10, and then when they created the high school assessment, the state statute for that assessment called the Utah Standards Assessment, which was which was SAGE and now is RISE. That test in the statute is just for grades 3 through 8 now. So the only change that impacted the Parent Review Committee was the statute change to change which students should take the Utah Standards Assessment, which went from
Right.
3 through 10 down to 3 through 8.
The concern was the parents not, the reason why it was set up in the first place is for parents to access and read the questions and be aware of the content of the questions if there was anything concerning in there. So I'm still wondering why we don't allow that same committee, because I was on that committee and we read the high school questions, we looked through them, that kind of a thing. It would just seem it would be kind of a checks and balances element. Anyways, I just had wondered if there was a specific reason why that was removed or changed.
Yeah, as your staff representing you in this process, we just stick to what the statute
Okay,
said, which is
okay.
for grades 3 through
Sure.
8. If we're directed differently, we don't have a
Right, the law
reason
doesn't.
not to do it.
Yeah, they changed the law, so therefore, okay, then I have another question, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
follow up.
What type, I just wonder, this isn't adaptive, right?
Correct.
Correct. Okay. What type of risk do we run when students in ninth grade might receive a score? Maybe they haven't taken a lot of science or something, but they receive a score of, let's say they get a score of 18 or maybe even 16, something that's maybe below that cut score. Do we run any risks with that child themselves thinking, there's my ACT score? Do you know what I mean? Is there any kind of a mental or emotional attachment to when they see that number going, that's my score, and thinking this is my ACT score, and not, you would hope they'd go, okay, that means I've got to improve this much. But is there any kind of a risk we run the other way too, where a child says, well, that's it, I can't go to college, I'm predicted to get a score of 16. And I know this is new territory because we're just putting this out, but do we foresee any?
Yeah, so it's hard to know how to measure that risk,
Yeah.
right? It seems like there's risk everywhere. We previously to this test in years past had administered the ACT Explore and the ACT Plan, which also provided a predictive ACT score. So I'll talk about the advantage of that, which I think also applies to the Utah Aspire Plus, is students are getting that information in a setting where they still have time to make changes in their learning programs, their achievement levels. On the reports, I'm going to let Sid talk about this more specifically, but on our reports we provide guidance of what you can do to improve your score, whether you received a predictive score that's lower than you wanted or whether you received one that surprised you with being higher. Giving guidance to students and parents of what are the steps you can take, because you still have 2 or 1 more year
Right.
to prepare for the ACT.
I just think, I think it's important that we prevent maybe that thinking from happening, and it
Yeah.
sounds like in some ways telling them what they can do would be part of that. I just would hope that that's not, they're not feeling like they're in a category now. I'm a 15 or I'm a, whatever, so.
Yeah, we agree. We would hope
Okay.
kids don't think of themselves that way if they get a score lower, but think
Yeah.
about what can I do to improve that. Do you want to speak about the reports? Do we address that?
Yeah, we haven't addressed that, but one of the things with the reports that we're looking at is something that will be a little bit different for teachers. And since we've moved from a course-based assessment to a grade-based assessment, is what those reports mean. So if I'm a high school biology teacher and you get a science score, but the student hasn't taken biology yet, that doesn't mean a whole lot for me as a teacher. So really the reports are focused at the student and the parents. We'll also have a parent portal available within about the next month that parents will be able to log in. So teachers or students aren't reliant on their teacher to show their score. The students will be able to log in as well as the parents to be able to see those reports. One other element that will be available, that's one thing the board voted on a few months ago, was to provide benchmark assessments that teachers are able to use. And those benchmark assessments are content specific, so the biology teacher will have biology assessments for the benchmark that they can use that to guide instruction for students. So as far as what's available for students on the end of level assessment, the summative assessment, they'll be able to see the scaled score and a proficiency level of whether on this assessment they are showing approaching proficient, and that predictive ACT range, as well as what are some of the things you can do. If you're a 9th grade student, you've got 2 years before you take the ACT. So recommendations for helping to prepare for that assessment.
Board Member Belknap.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that I went through this process when we started with SAGE the first time, and I just want you to know, as she was explaining this, I could see it in my head. And if we ever have the experience to go through and create these norms, it's amazing to now understand how this is all created. I just wanted to make that statement, so thanks.
Okay. Board Member Scott Hansen.
I think maybe you addressed this first question just a second ago, but as far as the proficiency scores, are those at a 12th grade proficiency graduate level, or are those take into account 9th grade and 10th grade? And then what about the different courses that the kids are taking? You know, how's that taken into account in the proficiency score? I understand now it's taken into account in the report that the student gets, but as a score, how do you factor that in?
So the score is reported on the standard level. So it's determining whether the student is proficient at that standard. So it's the 9th grade standards. Are they proficient on the 9th grade standards? That element of, are they preparing for college and career in 12th grade? It's more looking at, is a student who is preparing for college and career proficient at this level of the standards, to show that when they move to the next grade level, they'll be able to move into proficiency at that grade level standards.
Yeah, and that's really similar to what we do at the RISE test. Even though we're measuring, let's start with third grade proficiency in language arts and math. The way that the standards are written and the way that the proficiency cuts have been determined, as a parent, I should be able to, if my child gets a proficiency or a highly proficient in third grade, I should have confidence that my child at this point in their life is on track to be proficient for college and career when they exit the system. So all of those are designed that way, and the UTASPIRE Plus fits into that same mode of thinking.
So then particularly in 10th grade, where the students do have more latitude as far as classes, some of them will have taken certain classes, some will have not. That's just taken into account in the report that goes to the student?
Yeah, so the science is where we have the challenge. Almost, for language arts, every student, it's based on the 10th grade language arts core, and every 10th grader takes that, and they might get it in a accelerated or honors course or the regular course. Math is really similar. We have very few, around 4,000 students in the state that are on some kind of an advanced math track. Otherwise, the other 45,000 students in the state take the same math class in 9th and 10th grade. But science is when we move to a end of year instead of course-based. Science has been a challenge, and science teachers feel that as well, because we don't have a 9th or 10th grade science course. And so it's been challenging. We've involved Ricky Scott and his staff and the people he works with in the field in developing the blueprint, and trying to come up with a way to measure science without, because one of the fears is we wouldn't want an assessment to drive curriculum, assessments to support curriculum and instruction. And if we said we're going to measure biology in 10th grade, well, the LEAs then are going to start teaching biology in the 10th grade, and I don't think that's what the board would want to have, and I know my background in education, I wouldn't want to see that practice come into play.
Okay, thank you. Just one more, Chair. So this panel that reviewed the proficiency scores, do they feel, when they look at this overall proficiency levels, where most of those, if we put proficient and highly proficient together, are less than 50%, do they feel that's accurate?
Yeah, so that was a big part of that data and discussion. So the fourth level of the step, after they reviewed the items, they gave their feedback, they were actually able to see these numbers, and then they went through that process 2 more times. So these final recommendations, where we're showing that, hey, with these cuts, we have less than 50% of students are proficient. They were also able to see past SAGE proficiencies. So for example, in 9th grade, ELA in ninth grade in the past, we had at a state level 41.8% in 2017-18 students proficient, where this year with the Utah Aspire Plus there would be 48% proficient. So they were able to see past SAGE scores. That didn't necessarily change that was shown after the fact, but they were able to say, oh yeah, we actually are fairly in line with what we've seen in the past state level on SAGE data. As I mentioned, the one difference in ELA, we're a little bit higher at a state level than we have been in the past, where science, we're a little bit lower than we have been in the past.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or Board Member Janet Cannon?
Yeah, I was just looking at this again, and I noticed that on this data, you include STEM at the bottom, and on a couple of those, not on the predicted ACT, but on the cut scores and the spring data. So can you just kind of explain to me, what is STEM covering? I mean, we're covering science, we're covering mathematics, and where did this STEM come from, and what is it going to do? How's it going to benefit our students, our teachers, et cetera?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the STEM designation on the report is really just used for information for the student. It's not used in accountability, and it's not used at any state level. It's just information. It's not something that is used for the student or for a particular teacher. It really is just a combination of that science and math score. And the reason that it's included there is that it's part of the ACT overall report. When a student takes the ACT, they also get a STEM score or report, grade, I guess. It's not a grade, a score. And so the STEM is included on there. The same with the overall ELA score. It's something that's included on the ACT. The student gets an ELA score. The ELA score is something that's going to be used for accountability. That's what will be used in ninth grade and 10th grade for our state accountability, that ELA score. And that's a combination of the reading and English test scores.
Okay. Board Member Jenny Earl.
Thank you for letting me ask one more question. Can you talk to me just a little bit? I know this is supposed to be able to measure both predictive and growth. How do you measure growth when we've got kids? I'm just thinking of high school. We're taking different classes. Kids are doing different things. Anyways, what does that growth look like?
Okay, so we'll continue to use SGPs, or student growth percentiles. That's how we measure growth for our current accountability system. So each student at the end of the year gets an SGP, a student growth percentile, for their content in grades 3 through 8. And they'll continue to get that. The calculation for that, I'm trying to think of a way to explain this quickly. Let's say we all take the same test. We might have different experiences both in our home and at school, and all those things that happen. Even in the same class, we might have different experiences. We take the test and we get a scale score, and then that scale score is cataloged. And next year, wherever we are, we might move throughout the state, and we take the test that we're going to take that year. Student growth percentile takes us, and this happens in large numbers, so my example might be a little distorted because you have thousands of people for this to work. We line me up, so if I had a scale score of, I don't know, let's look back here, whoops. So if my scale score was right at the cut in English 9th grade, I got a 165. We'll take everybody in the state who got a 165 on that scale score, and we put them into, I don't know, a bucket. And then you take those and spread them out across a percentile, and then that student growth percentile comes from that. So it's almost assessment agnostic in a way, because as soon as we get paired together the previous year, we're considered a similar student academically, and then we look to see the next year, that group of kids who were similar, how did they make growth and progress, and it's done through a percentile ranking. That's really oversimplifying, and I might have created more questions than I should have, but...
We'll meet next week, though, right?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, and then just listening to this whole process, it just kind of emphasizes the point that we need more than just, we need to be looking at schools on a more comprehensive level, because there are so many variables at the high school level in particular. So anyways, that's just my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, and this is something I try to tell every audience I'm in front of. One assessment score for anybody, for you, me, for our children, is that. And we should look at that and not devalue it, but look at it and see how it fits into the context of all the other things we know about that student, about my child. and see if it makes sense with the things I know about them. And if there's some kind of an outlier, then it gives me an opportunity to look closer to see why did my child not perform as well as I'd expect them to, or it's just a piece of evidence to help us with the overall picture, which I think is your point.
Any other questions, comments? I just might want to throw this in here. I'm excited about the progress of assessment, and in my mind, just one board member's mind, it's kind of like, you know, assessment's a big word, and it's really easy to pile on. Like, oh, let's learn more. Let's know even more and more and more. And there's a part of me that says to myself, when do we keep it at some kind of minimum, I would say, standard of assessment? So because I can see as we get more and more into this, that piling on can happen. It's like, oh, look at this beast that we just created, all in the name of assessment. And so I'm curious, in your world, and on this topic, how do you keep it refined without getting
Yeah.
it too broad?
Are you talking about the quantity of assessment?
The quantity piece.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I know that you had the Removing Barriers Task Force that functioned under the direction of the board a few years ago that directed to reduce the amount of time spent testing. And I think the board responded to that by pulling writing back, and we just administer writing now in grades 5 and 8, which I think is part of that question. Your overall question is, what's the right amount? We've also seen some school districts, Canyon District specifically, who did a study to see how much time are our kids spending testing, both on statewide and district mandated tests, because that varies across districts. Some districts test pretty heavily, and other districts allow that to be a teacher classroom decision, and they don't offer a lot of district-wide assessments. I don't know the answer to that. As your employee, we implement what you guys have directed us to, so, and that's the right amount for us.
Well, we're directing, but then we also have suggestions and stuff, and so if we are getting into that suggestion mode, let's, whatever we can do, let's try to stay in the direction, the clear direction, because I think it's exciting, and it's good to know more and more, but we have to keep those checks
Yeah.
on it, and I'm glad the dialogue is still there about how much time but if we keep that time piece and we're trying to track that with that our goal in mind, but just making sure education's happening is a great goal in itself, but doing it all in a timely manner is another. So I thank you for your comments there, but also feel free to speak up if we're not given clear direction or
Okay.
we do want to pile on. So, Jennifer Gravitt.
I just want to underscore what Darren was saying. From a teacher perspective, as a language arts teacher, I went from 6 days of testing to 2. And so more instructional time, less testing with just as much information, I'm hoping. So just wanted to add to that.
Well, and LEAs can add more if they
Yes.
choose to, but at our level, we're keeping that, so thank you. Any other questions? Did you have more to present? Okay, I guess I'm at this time right now, I'm seeking a motion to accept the recommended proficiency cuts for the Utah Aspire Plus assessment. Have a motion, second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, let's vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting is unanimous. Thank you, Sydney with a C, and Darren Nielsen. Okay, Superintendent Dixon. You're up next with Tiffany.